The first time I saw him, I froze. My father, someone I had spent a lifetime believing had walked away, was lying frail and pale in a hospice bed. The machines hummed around him, masking the sound of his shallow breaths, yet I could hear the unspoken tension in the room. Nurses moved with practiced calm, but I felt it differently, a weight of history pressing down. My mother's words echoed in my mind. He abandoned you, never wanted you. And yet, here he was, vulnerable, incapable human. I realized, as I stepped closer, that everything I had been told might have been a carefully crafted lie. The truth, I knew, would not arrive gently. I grew up believing my world had only two certainties: my mother's words and the rhythm of her routines. She spoke with authority that brooked no question, and I, a quiet child, learned to listen rather than challenge. Breakfasts were silent affairs, punctuated only by the scraping of spoons and the distant hum of the heater. I observed the small patterns: how she folded napkins with precision, how she frowned at letters addressed to my father, and how her gaze lingered on the photographs on the mantel, as if they held secrets she did not intend to share. School was a landscape of faces I barely knew, corridors where I passed unnoticed, and classrooms where the teacher's voice was a background rhythm. I carried home my accomplishments in silence, knowing my mother's approval was conditional but consistent when I conformed. At first, it was simple trust. If she said my father had left, I believed it. If she claimed I was the one to be careful, I obeyed. In that structure, I found safety, even if it was a narrow safety, fenced in by her version of reality. Weekends were a quiet ritual. She took me to the library, where I would sit with my nose in a book for hours while she browsed among the stacks, occasionally offering a comment or suggestion. Sometimes I would catch her staring at a closed door, her fingers lightly tapping the edge, and I imagined there were conversations I was not meant to hear. Those moments passed without explanation, and I never asked. Trust, I had learned, was less about certainty and more about survival. Friends existed in fragments. I made connections, yes, but I never let them in too deeply. Sharing thoughts about my father was off limits. Any hint of curiosity was met with swift redirection. "He's gone." "That's how it is," my mother would say. Her voice carried no room for argument, and I learned that some questions did not have answers I was meant to hear. Still, at night, I would sometimes lie awake, trying to fit together pieces of a man I had never met, imagining how he might have looked, what he might have said, and how he had disappeared from the fabric of my life. Work, when I reached adulthood, became a sanctuary of quiet control. I observed patterns, noted inconsistencies in numbers, emails, schedules, small truths that floated beneath the surface. Colleagues assumed I was compliant and agreeable, perhaps even naive. I let them. It was easier than explaining why I asked questions that unsettled them or why I lingered on details no one else considered important. Observation, I learned, was a kind of armor, and restraint was a form of strength. Even family gatherings were a theater of subtle signals. I noticed my mother's small movements, the tilt of her head when someone mentioned my father, the brief narrowing of her eyes at a cousin's passing comment. I would smile politely, nod, and return to the periphery. No one suspected I noticed or that I remembered. Every whispered conversation, every glance, every half-finished sentence was catalogued, stored quietly in the background of my mind. I did not act. I waited. Within that world, I cultivated an internal equilibrium. I trusted what I saw, but I trusted more what I learned from careful observation. My mother's words shaped my outward life. My quiet attention shaped my inner one. There was comfort in the routine, the breakfast rituals, the walk to school, the hum of the office, the rhythm of life contained within rules that were never questioned. I rarely spoke of the man I had never known. I rarely spoke at all, except when necessary. My voice, I discovered, was most powerful when it remained restrained. Looking back, I can see how that trust was both my anchor and my cage. I trusted because I had to. I observed because I could not help it. I lived quietly, unnoticed, under the shadow of absence that I had been told was simply reality. And yet, even in that acceptance, I sensed a tension I could not name, an edge where something unseen had been withheld from me, a story incomplete. I filed it away, tucked it in silence, and went on. Life moved in its small, steady cadence, predictable and unremarkable, until a fissure appeared decades later, when the world I had trusted began to show cracks too wide to ignore. It started in ways so subtle I almost didn't notice them. Small inconsistencies that brushed against the edges of my awareness, like the way a shadow falls differently in the morning light than I expect. Letters addressed to my father sometimes slipped through the mail, and my mother would intercept them, her hands trembling ever so slightly before she folded the envelope away. She never explained why. I asked once quietly, and she laughed, a hollow, dismissive sound, and said, "It's nothing, child, forget it." I did, because forgetting was easier than pressing. Visits from distant relatives became uncomfortable exercises in restraint. An aunt would mention a detail, a memory, a place, a brief interaction involving my father, and my mother's reaction would be sharp, immediate, almost rehearsed. She would redirect, sometimes with a joke that made the air feel tight, sometimes with silence that stretched uncomfortably long. I noticed. I stored the moments away, aware of the discord, but unsure if I had the right to question it. At school and later at work, I began noticing things too. Small comments that didn't add up, a story someone told that didn't match what I'd been told. My colleagues, friends, neighbors, they assumed I was oblivious, that I accepted the narratives I had been given. I did not. I filed the moments quietly, without confrontation, without alarm. It was an instinct, to watch, to measure, to wait. The discomfort was growing, but it was slow, almost imperceptible. Even routine family meals started to feel off. My mother would speak of past events with a precision that felt performative, as though she were reciting a script she had memorized over decades. Sometimes, when she spoke, her voice carried a subtle tension that I could not place, an edge that suggested control, concealment. I felt it quietly, like a vibration beneath the surface of ordinary life. I said nothing. I smiled. I ate. There were also small omissions that prickled at me. Questions I asked that went unanswered, topics that were diverted too quickly. I asked about places my father had lived, about people who had known him, about stories that seemed to vanish the moment they were mentioned. Each time, my mother's demeanor shifted slightly, though outwardly she remained composed. Her eyes would harden, her hands would tighten around a cup, and a pause would stretch longer than it should. Those pauses became louder than words. Sometimes, in the quiet of my room, I revisited old photographs. Faces stared back at me, frozen in time, and I wondered what had been edited out, what had been lost in translation between memory and the story I had been told. I began to feel a subtle distrust, not just of her words, but of the way the world had been constructed around me. Yet I remained outwardly compliant, because defiance had never seemed safe, and curiosity had always been met with dismissal. The first nights I slept poorly were nights I noticed patterns in dreams. Faces I didn't recognize, voices I barely remembered, fragments of conversations that didn't match my memories. I awoke with a tightness in my chest, a low, nagging unease I could not articulate. Still, daylight brought routine, and routine brought reassurance. I returned to school, to work, to the rhythm of life that my mother maintained. I carried the discomfort quietly, like a stone in my pocket, aware but not yet willing to confront it. Even as the unease grew, I reminded myself that perhaps I was imagining things. Perhaps shadows could deceive, and perhaps memories could mislead. I focused on what I could control. The books I read, the spreadsheets I balanced, the careful notes I took on discrepancies in minor events. My observation became meticulous, almost ritualistic. The discomfort remained beneath the surface, a quiet hum that never quite allowed me to forget that something was off. By the end of those years, the unease had become a steady companion. I could no longer ignore the tension that threaded through the simplest interactions, yet I lacked clarity. I trusted my mother, and yet I sensed the fissures. I continued to live within the boundaries she set, but I observed more closely, listened more carefully, cataloged every detail. The early discomfort was subtle, almost invisible to anyone else, but for me it was real. A warning, quiet and persistent, that would shape the way I approached the world for decades to come. The first time I truly questioned what I had been told, I didn't know it. It was a photograph, tucked into a drawer I had never opened. I was looking for something else entirely, a forgotten school report, but my fingers brushed against the edges of a small envelope, yellowed with age. Inside, the photograph captured my father smiling, arm around a woman I didn't recognize, in a room filled with light. Something about the image stopped me. It wasn't just the smile or the unfamiliar room. It was the certainty that my mother had never mentioned this moment, never told me this woman existed. I didn't show her the photograph. I held it against my chest and studied it in silence. The next day, I tried casually to ask about that time, about that woman, about my father. My mother's answer was immediate, sharp, dismissive. "You'll only confuse yourself with these questions. Focus on what matters here and now." Her voice was calm, but the underlying edge was unmistakable. I noted it, silently, storing the moment alongside the photograph. Other inconsistencies began surfacing in small ways. A neighbor casually mentioned seeing my father in town years ago, long after my mother said he had left. A cousin remembered him attending a family event that, according to my mother, he had skipped entirely. Each piece, small on its own, began to form a pattern I could no longer ignore. It was like watching a tapestry being slowly undone, threads slipping through fingers I had assumed were steady. I started paying closer attention to details I had once overlooked. Letters that disappeared from the mailbox. Phone calls that my mother answered quickly and then insisted I had imagined. A pattern of omissions, of careful control over information, that suggested there was more beneath the surface than I had been allowed to see. I cataloged these observations in my mind, arranging them like pieces of a puzzle, without knowing what the final image would be. It wasn't anger that stirred inside me. I had learned to restrain such emotions. It was a slow, simmering tension, a growing awareness that the foundation of my life might be built on selective truths. I noticed how my mother's hands would tighten when the topic of my father came up, how her eyes flickered briefly toward the locked drawer in her study when I mentioned a name or a date, how a slight hesitation, almost imperceptible, followed every attempt I made to probe a memory. These were small, quiet signals, but they resonated louder than any outburst ever could. I began to seek corroboration quietly. I asked distant relatives questions with a casualness that belied my inner curiosity, and I watched their reactions. Some fumbled, offering half answers, their eyes darting away. Others were hesitant, choosing their words carefully. It was enough. enough to confirm that the narrative I had accepted without question might be incomplete, manipulated, or deliberately false. At work, I found parallels in my professional life. Situations where information had been withheld or altered, where discrepancies in records suggested intentional concealment. I became attuned to patterns of omission and manipulation, recognizing the same subtle architecture in my personal life that I saw in professional systems. Observation had always been my strength. Now it became a tool for survival, a way to navigate a world that might not be what it seemed. Sleep became restless, haunted not by dreams, but by scenarios I constructed in the quiet hours of the night. I imagined conversations with my mother, confrontations I would never have, the questions I could never safely ask. The photograph, the letters, the vague recollections of relatives, they all pressed at the edges of my mind, demanding acknowledgement. Yet during the day, I continued to function within the structure I had learned, restrained and careful, letting nothing leak into the visible world. These were the first red flags. I could no longer accept the narrative I had been given. The cracks were visible, the inconsistencies undeniable, and yet the truth remained obscured, lurking beneath layers of omission, silence, and practiced control. I was beginning to understand that trust, once given freely, could be quietly eroded. And in that realization, I sensed the weight of what might come, the slow unraveling of a life carefully constructed around someone else's version of reality. The moment I began to voice my observations, the atmosphere shifted. It was subtle at first, an almost imperceptible tightening of my mother's lips, a tilt of her head that suggested annoyance. I had learned to read her gestures, to notice the quiet signals that preceded her displeasure. I mentioned the photograph once casually, almost as a passing thought. She smiled, a practiced, empty curve, and said, "You're imagining things. That's not important." Her tone was calm, almost sweet, but the underlying force was undeniable. I had been dismissed before, but now the dismissal came with a sharpened edge. Every attempt to probe further was met with similar treatment. Questions about letters, phone calls, even minor events that contradicted the story I had been told were minimized, laughed off, or redirected. "You're making mountains out of molehills," she would say, her voice even, almost teasing. The effect was disorienting. I began to doubt myself, questioning the validity of what I had seen, heard, and remembered. That doubt was exactly what she intended. Friends and family, whether intentionally or unconsciously, reinforced her narrative. When I raised a point, someone would offer a half-hearted defense of my mother, a casual dismissal of my concerns, as though I were the one overreacting. The world seemed aligned against the truth I was sensing. My observations felt both acute and futile. Each time I held my tongue, I collected more data, more fragments of inconsistency. But every attempt at confrontation was met with a wall of disbelief or mockery. The gaslighting was slow, methodical. My mother would recount events with subtle variations, framing them in ways that cast me as naive or mistaken. I began to recognize the pattern. She didn't just deny. She reshaped reality around her, creating an alternative history I was expected to accept. And when I hesitated or questioned her version, she framed it as my own failing, my inability to understand. It was exhausting, though I hid it well. The tension settled in my chest, a quiet ache that never fully left. I began measuring my words, rehearsing questions before even asking them, anticipating the responses that would twist my attempts into proofs of incompetence. I noticed how her eyes would flash briefly with impatience, how her hands would twitch as if containing a restrained anger, and how the room seemed to shrink whenever I approached the subject of my father. At times, I caught myself doubting everything. Had I been imagining the letters, the calls, the hints from relatives? Was I reading too much into the photograph, the faded notes, the half-spoken remarks? The effect was subtle but cumulative. My mind became a careful ledger, balancing evidence against dismissal, truth against manipulation. Restraint became a shield, observation became my weapon. Yet even as I catalogued every detail, the gaslighting continued, patient, invisible, unrelenting. There were moments when the dismissal felt almost casual, almost gentle, and that made it worse. A smile, a pat on the hand, a soft laugh at my worries, all perfectly ordinary gestures on the surface, but I knew they were designed to undermine me, to convince me that the unease I felt was only in my imagination. The quiet cruelty was almost invisible, but I felt it in the tension between her words and the truths they obscured. I began to withdraw, internally and externally. Conversations became carefully controlled. I measured what I said, whom I spoke to, and what I revealed. Every interaction became a test, every word a calculation. My mother's control over information was absolute, and the emotional pressure she applied was quiet but relentless. I recognized the pattern. The more I resisted, the more she tightened the boundaries, yet she did it with such subtlety that it could always be denied. Even as the gaslighting intensified, my observations grew sharper. Every contradiction, every half-truth, every carefully staged reaction was noted, filed, and remembered. I learned to read the silences, to watch the gestures, to hear the unspoken language beneath her calm words. I did not react. I simply observed, recording the emotional weight, the quiet manipulations, and the fractures in the reality I had been given. By the end of this period, I understood two things clearly: that I was being deceived, and that speaking out carried its own dangers. My mother's dismissal was a form of power, subtle but undeniable. It was designed to make me question myself, to erode my certainty, and to keep the truth hidden behind layers of calm authority. And I had no choice but to continue navigating this world with care, patience, and silent attention, knowing that the stakes of discovery were higher than I had ever imagined. It began with a file, dusty and overlooked, tucked into the corner of a filing cabinet in my mother's study. I had been searching for something entirely unrelated, old receipts, notes, anything to fill gaps in memory. But the folder caught my eye, almost as if it had been waiting. Inside were documents, hospital records, letters, and fragments of legal papers, many of them unsigned or half-completed. Each one suggested a reality I had been told did not exist. My father had not left. He had been kept at a distance, his absence engineered with deliberate care. I held the papers with trembling hands, aware of the weight of discovery. For decades, I had trusted my mother's narrative, accepted it as truth, and built my life around it. Yet now, in the quiet light of the study, the first undeniable evidence of deception lay before me. Names, dates, locations, all meticulously recorded, all contradicting the story I had been told. I could not ignore them, nor could I immediately confront her. Instead, I catalogued everything, noting connections, discrepancies, and implications. The partial exposure came in fragments, like a puzzle revealing itself too slowly. A former neighbor, hesitant at first, mentioned seeing my father in town not long after the date I had been told he had vanished. A distant cousin admitted that he had spoken to my father on multiple occasions, long after my mother insisted there had been no contact. These confirmations were quiet, almost accidental, but they reinforced what the documents had begun to reveal. The reality I had believed in was a construction, carefully maintained and deliberately incomplete. I began to understand the mechanisms of concealment. My mother's control over information had not been chaotic, it had been systematic. Letters intercepted, phone calls ignored, memories reframed. Even the household itself was arranged to support the narrative. Photographs altered, memories rehearsed, casual remarks designed to reinforce absence. The layers were intricate, and the intention behind them became painfully clear. She had not merely hidden my father, she had controlled the very perception of his existence. As the pieces came together, I became acutely aware of witnesses, people whose memories aligned with the documents. Each corroboration added weight, transforming doubt into understanding. The nurse who had tended my father during a brief hospital stay, a neighbor who had delivered packages to his address, even a coworker who remembered his voice on a recorded call. All were small, quiet proofs of the truth. I listened to them without reaction, recording their accounts meticulously. My restraint was deliberate. Any sign of emotion might alert my mother or compromise the slow accumulation of evidence. At night, I revisited the fragments I had gathered, laying them out on the desk in careful order. Dates intersected, locations overlapped, and inconsistencies in my mother's stories became glaring. I realized that the betrayal was not a single act, but a lifetime of manipulation, orchestrated with precision. The emotional cost was subtle yet relentless, a quiet ache of recognition that the foundation of my life had been built on deliberate omissions and distortions. Even as I cataloged the evidence, I felt the tension of proximity. My mother remained present, her calm demeanor masking any awareness of my discovery. I had not yet confronted her, and I was aware that the closer I came to the full truth, the more dangerous it would be to act openly. The documents were partial, yes, but they were undeniable. Each page, each witness account, each subtle corroboration chipped away at the reality I had accepted for decades. I noticed the quiet consequences beginning to emerge. Conversations shifted when certain names came up. Letters I had requested were met with hesitation, delayed just enough to suggest someone was aware. My mother's subtle gestures, the tightening of her hands around a teacup, the quick glance toward the study door spoke volumes, even when she said nothing. I recorded it all quietly, without comment or confrontation. Observation had become my method of control, restraint my shield. It was during one of these quiet evenings, sorting through documents by lamplight, that I understood the full weight of partial exposure. The truth was no longer a question of possibility. It was an unfolding reality, and I was at its center. I had glimpsed it in fragments, pieced it together from whispers, photographs, letters, and records. Yet the entirety remained just out of reach, a story half told, waiting for the final confirmation that would change everything. In that moment, I realized that the stakes had shifted. I could no longer remain entirely within the safe confines of ignorance. The betrayal was real, deliberate, and systemic. My mother's authority over truth had cracks wide enough for light to filter through, and I had seen it. I felt both empowered and burdened, the weight of understanding pressing against my chest. Yet I did not act. I could not. Partial exposure demanded patience, careful measurement, and continued restraint. The truth had begun to reveal itself, and I would watch quietly, letting it accumulate, knowing that the consequences, for her, for me, for the man who had been kept from me, were already beginning to take shape. The tension that had been building for decades finally began to demand space. I no longer needed to wonder if my observations were accurate. The evidence and corroboration had aligned too clearly to ignore. What remained now was the reaction, the way the people involved would respond when the cracks I had quietly cataloged began to show through. And with my mother, the escalation was subtle but unmistakable, a slow tightening around the truth that made each interaction a careful negotiation of restraint. It began with small confrontations, ones I did not provoke but could not avoid. A casual mention of my father in conversation, an innocent question about a place he had lived, a reference to a shared memory, elicited a reaction that was immediate, sharp, and measured. My mother's face would harden, her smile vanishing almost imperceptibly. Her hands would clench around the edge of a table, and I could see the restraint in her posture. She was aware, I knew, that her narrative was beginning to unravel. Other people began to reflect the change as well. Distant relatives who had once been hesitant to confirm details now volunteered information, their caution replaced by subtle urgency. "I suppose it doesn't matter anymore," one aunt said, her voice quiet but heavy with implication. A former neighbor hinted at stories she had long kept silent, as if the careful balance of secrecy was losing its hold. The pattern of concealment that had shaped my childhood was no longer absolute. The walls that had contained me and him were beginning to show cracks. The documents I had discovered became instruments in the quiet escalation. I began cross-referencing records, noting inconsistencies and connections, observing the reactions of those who had participated in maintaining the narrative. When I raised questions, I did so with precision, never accusation, letting the evidence speak for itself. Each response, each pause, each subtle gesture revealed more than words ever could. My mother, once untouchable in her authority, now exhibited small signs of unease. A flinch, a hesitation, a carefully controlled smile that did not reach her eyes. The emotional pressure intensified, but I remained restrained. I had learned that any outward display of anger or frustration would be counterproductive, that the quiet observation was more powerful than confrontation. I watched as the stakes tightened. My mother's careful constructions began to show their flaws, her control slipping just enough to make her defenses visible. The manipulation she had relied upon for decades was no longer invisible. It was exposed in the subtle reactions she could not fully suppress. I began documenting the escalation with meticulous care. Each interaction, each subtle admission or slip of the tongue, each corroboration from witnesses was recorded in my mind and in private notes. I did not confront her directly, not yet. Instead, I allowed the tension to build, understanding that the slow burn of truth was more devastating than any sudden revelation. I became patient, methodical, and precise, my restraint creating a quiet pressure that was almost imperceptible but undeniably present. At times, the tension was palpable. I noticed the brief moments when her control faltered, when her carefully crafted facade wavered under the weight of exposure. A glance too long at a letter, a slip in phrasing, a hesitation in her voice, all signals that she knew her influence over the narrative was eroding. I remained silent, internalizing the growing weight of the truth, cataloging each subtle reaction. My own restraint became a mirror of the power she had once wielded, quiet but firm. Even the environment seemed to shift in response. Conversations that once flowed naturally became charged, pauses lengthening into moments pregnant with unspoken meaning. The house, once a place of habitual calm, carried a tension that was almost physical, a vibration beneath the surface of ordinary life. I moved through it carefully, watching, noting, and quietly understanding the escalation for what it was. The inevitable confrontation of truth against decades of deception. It was during a late evening, reviewing documents by the soft light of a desk lamp, that I realized the full weight of the moment. The escalation was not just about uncovering the past. It was about control, power, and the consequences that followed. My mother's authority, once absolute, was no longer unchallenged. My father, absent but present in evidence, had begun to assert a presence through the fragments I had gathered. And I, long underestimated, quiet, and restrained, had become the arbiter of observation, the keeper of evidence, the one who understood the architecture of concealment better than anyone else. The stakes were now undeniable. Any misstep could provoke confrontation, resistance, or denial. But I did not act rashly. I understood the calculus of restraint. The slower the escalation, the more devastating the eventual revelation. Every conversation, every gesture, every acknowledgement or hesitation from others became part of a pattern I could observe, interpret, and record. The psychological weight was immense, yet I bore it silently, aware that the quiet accumulation of evidence and subtle influence was more powerful than anger, accusation, or spectacle. By the end of this period, the situation had transformed. The delicate balance my mother had maintained for decades was unraveling, her influence over narrative weakened, and the truth inching closer to full exposure. Yet the world remained calm on the surface, the escalation hidden behind gestures, pauses, and unspoken acknowledgement. I felt the pressure, understood the cost, and recognized that the slow, quiet escalation was far more consequential than any dramatic confrontation could ever be. And through it all, I remained patient, restrained, and meticulously observant, knowing that the real power was no longer hers. It was in the truth I had quietly uncovered. I had been patient for years, cataloging inconsistencies, observing every subtle reaction, and gathering fragments of truth like shards of glass. The weight of knowledge settled into me quietly, pressing against my chest in a rhythm I had learned to live with. Each day, I reminded myself that restraint was strength, observation was power, and outward reaction was a liability. And yet, there came a point when patience itself became unbearable, not because I wanted to act, but because the moral cost of silence was finally undeniable. It was an ordinary morning when the weight pressed hardest. I watched my mother move through the kitchen, her hands shaking slightly as she prepared coffee, a small tremor I had never noticed before. She glanced at a stack of letters I knew contained fragments of my father's life, and I could see the fleeting tension in her eyes. I had cataloged these details countless times, but now, with the evidence fully assembled in my mind, the significance of each gesture was acute. The calm exterior I maintained felt fragile, the quiet restraint almost unbearable. I considered the path before me. I could confront her, demand answers, release the words I had held for decades, and let the flood of truth spill into the open. Or I could remain silent, let the evidence accumulate, and allow consequences to unfold quietly, inevitably, without spectacle. The first option promised immediate acknowledgement, perhaps relief, but at a cost I was not willing to pay. Outbursts, confrontations, accusations, they would obscure the clarity of truth with emotion. Restraint, as always, remained the more powerful choice. The moral tension was relentless. I thought of my father. If he were alive, if he could see what had been done, what he had been denied. The betrayal was staggering, yet my anger, if expressed, could change nothing. The system of concealment had functioned for decades. Its unraveling required patience, strategy, and measured observation. I recognized that the breaking point was not about me lashing out. It was about understanding the cost of knowing, and the silent power of letting truth assert itself through its own gravity. There were moments when the restraint felt like a cage. I walked through familiar spaces, noting the subtle signs of manipulation that persisted even now. The locked drawers, the carefully staged photographs, the casual, rehearsed remarks meant to redirect or dismiss. Each gesture reminded me of what had been taken, what had been hidden, and what I had endured. Yet the restraint was deliberate. I reminded myself that observation was a form of moral authority, that my quiet endurance had more weight than any dramatic confrontation. I began reviewing the evidence again, mentally tracing every document, witness statement, and observation. Each piece confirmed the depth of the betrayal. My mother had not merely obscured my father's existence. She had reshaped reality itself, constructing a narrative that isolated me, controlled my perception, and denied me agency over my own understanding. The psychological cost was immense, yet I bore it silently, knowing that the ultimate power lay in the careful orchestration of truth and consequence, not in momentary emotional release. At night, sleep offered no refuge. I lay awake, tracing scenarios, imagining reactions, calculating outcomes. The breaking point was not a single moment of emotional collapse. It was the quiet, persistent realization that my life had been framed by deception, and that restraint was both my shield and my method of justice. I understood that acting hastily could disrupt the careful alignment of evidence, witnesses, and corroborations I had cultivated. The moral imperative was clear: observe, record, and allow the consequences to assert themselves. Yet the internal pressure was undeniable. My chest ached with the weight of betrayal, and my mind replayed decades of small omissions, manipulations, and falsehoods. The breaking point was not a scream, a confrontation, or an accusation. It was the recognition that the cost of knowing had reached its peak. I felt it as a quiet fracture within myself, the acknowledgement that trust had been irreparably broken, that love had been manipulated, and that the life I had been led to accept had been orchestrated by deliberate concealment. I did not act outwardly, but I changed internally. My understanding became absolute. Every observation, every fragment of evidence, every corroborated account coalesced into a clear picture of truth. I recognized the betrayal in its full scope, and I allowed it to settle, like sediment in water, heavy and immovable. The emotional breaking point was reached not through action, but through the complete comprehension of injustice and the deliberate choice to maintain restraint, knowing that the quiet unfolding of consequence would be far more effective than any immediate reaction. By the end of this period, I existed in a state of careful equilibrium. The moral and emotional breaking point had been crossed, yet I remained composed, deliberate, and observant. I understood the cost of truth and the responsibility it carried. My mother's authority had been challenged, not through confrontation, but through quiet endurance and measured observation. I had reached the deepest layer of recognition. Betrayal was complete, moral authority had shifted, and the consequences, though yet unseen, would be inevitable. The truth, once partially hidden, now began to assert itself with quiet inevitability. I did not confront my mother directly. I did not raise my voice or make declarations. Instead, the weight of evidence and the subtle corroborations I had gathered created an environment in which denial became increasingly impossible. Others began to acknowledge what had been hidden, sometimes inadvertently, sometimes with hesitation, but each acknowledgement reinforced the unraveling that I had long foreseen. A distant cousin, during a casual conversation, mentioned an interaction with my father that could not have occurred without awareness of his existence. My mother smiled politely but did not comment. It was enough. The absence of denial spoke louder than words. Small moments like this repeated, and I observed them with quiet intensity, noting each subtle sign of recognition, each lapse in control. The consequences were beginning to manifest not in confrontation, but in acknowledgement. I also observed the impact on those who had participated, knowingly or not, in maintaining the narrative. Relatives who had once hesitated to confirm details now seemed uneasy in their silence. Former neighbors shifted when questions arose, their responses guarded, revealing awareness of a truth they had been complicit in obscuring. Even casual acquaintances who had unknowingly reinforced the story began to reconsider their recollections. The web of concealment was fraying, and I, quietly observant, could see the strain in the behavior of everyone around me. The documents that had first revealed the hidden reality became tools of subtle consequence. Letters, hospital records, legal fragments, all of them, when referenced with precision, created pressure without confrontation. I never threatened, never accused, never demanded explanation. I merely allowed the facts to exist, arranging them so that the inconsistencies were undeniable. And slowly, the ripple effect spread. The careful structures of omission and deception began to collapse under the weight of their own inconsistencies. My mother's control over the narrative weakened further. I noticed moments of hesitation, subtle missteps, and expressions that betrayed a faint panic behind her carefully maintained composure. She had been powerful for decades, shaping reality, directing perception, and maintaining authority. Now the power had shifted, not violently, not dramatically, but through quiet inevitability. Her authority remained, superficially intact, yet hollow at its core, and I watched it unravel with restrained attention. I also observed the emotional consequences for myself. The weight of long-buried resentment, of decades of doubt and manipulated memory, had been heavy, but now it felt slightly lighter. There was no satisfaction in witnessing the unraveling, no gloating in seeing the subtle acknowledgement of wrongdoing. The consequences were not mine to celebrate. They were simply the natural result of actions taken decades ago. My restraint allowed the truth to speak for itself, and that, I understood, was the most profound consequence of all. At work, I noticed the same principle applying in smaller ways. Where omission or concealment had previously caused minor disruptions, truth began asserting itself in quiet, almost imperceptible corrections. Documents were corrected, histories reconciled, discrepancies noted and addressed. There was no fanfare, no dramatic confrontation, just the steady, inevitable realignment of reality to match fact. It was a lesson mirrored in my personal life now. The quiet persistence of truth carries consequences even when it remains unspoken. The final impact on my mother was subtle but undeniable. She remained present, her composure superficially unchanged, yet small lapses in control became apparent. A quick glance at a letter, a pause in speech, a flicker of recognition, these quiet moments revealed the shifting power dynamic. She could no longer maintain the absolute control she had wielded for decades. The consequences were not violent or dramatic, but they were profound in their psychological weight. I understood fully that the consequences were not about revenge. They were about alignment between truth and perception. I did not celebrate, I did not confront, I did not declare victory. Instead, I allowed the world to adjust naturally, quietly observing the subtle shifts in behavior, the acknowledgement of facts, and the unraveling of carefully maintained narratives. The consequences were real, palpable, and unavoidable, yet administered through silence, observation, and restraint. By the end of this period, the balance had shifted. The hidden reality was now recognized by those who could no longer ignore it. My mother's authority had diminished quietly but completely. The truth had asserted itself, not through spectacle, not through confrontation, but through the careful orchestration of observation, evidence, and patience. And I, quietly observant and restrained, had ensured that the consequences were inevitable, profound, and undeniable, without Ev.